Hey there. So you want to really nail speaking numbers in like the business world. We get it. I mean, board meetings and presentations, even like casual conversations can feel kind of like a minefield when you're, you know, tossing around those complex figures. We've got a whole treasure trove of insights here to help you navigate those tricky waters, those numerical waters with confidence and finesse. Let me tell you, I once saw a major presentation totally go off the rails when the speaker just completely fumbled over a key revenue projection. The whole room, you could just feel this like awkwardness,
Right.
and the message, it just got lost in this jumble of digits. It's really not just about getting the numbers right, but about wielding them with like precision and impact. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point.
So are you ready to unlock those secrets?
Yeah, let's dive right in. Let's start with those big, daunting numbers, the ones that often leave people tongue-tied. We've all seen them in financial reports or market analyses. You know the kind I'm talking about, right? Those numbers that kind of make your eyes glaze over.
Oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's like trying to decipher a foreign language sometimes.
Well, there's a really simple trick to kind of decode those numerical behemoths, grouping.
Yeah.
In English, we just naturally group large numbers in sets of three. It's almost like creating a rhythm, that our brains can latch onto and easily follow.
Right.
Like, think about it. 3,456,000,000 sounds way more manageable than just like a string of 9 digits.
Yeah, it's true. It's like adding punctuation to a sentence, right? Suddenly it's easier to breathe. But I've noticed that different industries seem to almost have their own like number speaking cultures. Tech companies, they love their abbreviations, while finance folks, they stick to more kind of formal pronouncements.
That's a great observation. And I think it really boils down to the values and priorities of each sector. In tech, where it's all about speed and disruption, they've kind of developed a shorthand to match that pace. It's about creating this sense of urgency and signaling their ambition for massive growth.
So it's not just about saving time, but also about projecting a certain image, a certain.
It's a good, exactly.
But then you have finance where every decimal point seems to carry like the weight of the world. Yeah.
Exactly. In the world of finance, precision and trust are absolutely paramount. Every digit, it really matters. And even a slight mispronunciation can really erode confidence. So they use those formal pronunciations and avoid any kind of casual abbreviations to really maintain that sense of accuracy and reliability.
Yeah, it's like the difference between a casual handshake and a really formal bow, right? Each gesture conveys a whole different level of respect and seriousness. But beyond these industry quirks, what about those times when we really need to be like super precise with our numbers versus those times when a more general approximation will get the job done?
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's where context really becomes key. In a formal presentation, or when you're dealing with sensitive financial information, precision, that's where it reigns supreme. Every decimal point can make a huge difference, and any ambiguity can lead to costly misunderstandings. But in a more casual brainstorm, or when you're just discussing broader trends, a well-placed around or approximately, that can actually enhance communication by focusing on the bigger picture.
Yeah, I like that. It's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Right. Okay.
A scalpel for surgery and a chainsaw for clearing a forest. Each has its purpose. Now let's tackle those tricky decimals and fractions. It feels like there are a million ways to say the same thing.
Yeah, you're not alone in that feeling. Even something as simple as a decimal point can be a bit of a linguistic minefield. For instance, Americans typically say point, right? While the British might say decimal or even not point. Right. And in parts of Europe, you might even hear comma instead of point.
Wow. It's a reminder that even like seemingly universal symbols can have these cultural nuances. It's like those hand gestures that mean one thing in one country and something completely different in another. But what about those situations where we need to use scientific notation? I remember feeling completely lost the first time I encountered that in a meeting.
Yeah, scientific notation can definitely seem intimidating at first, but it's really just a shorthand for expressing really large or very small numbers.
Yeah.
The key is knowing when to use the full form, like
Yeah.
1.5 times 10 to the power of 6 versus a shorter version like 1.5 times 10 to the 6th. Context, once again, is your guide.
So it's not about memorizing a rigid set of rules, but about developing this awareness of the appropriate language for each situation. But what about industry specific rules for decimal precision? Do I need to become like a walking encyclopedia of those?
No, relax. You don't need to memorize every single nuance, but instead focus on understanding the level of precision required in different fields. Banking and finance, for example, they demand extreme precision, often working with like multiple decimal places. Marketing, on the other hand, might be a little bit more flexible, allowing for rounded figures or approximations.
Right. It makes sense that that industries dealing with large sums of money would be extra careful with those decimal points. But while we're on the topic of precision, do you have any tips for handling those never-ending recurring decimals? It feels awkward, like trailing off or reading an endless string of digits.
Yeah. There's a pretty simple and elegant solution to that.
Oh, good.
Instead of stumbling through those repeating numbers, just say 0.3 recurring or 0.3 repeating.
Okay.
It's concise, it's professional, and it shows that you're in command of those numerical rebels.
Oh, I like that. It's like adding a period to a sentence, right?
Yeah.
It brings a sense of closure. But what about those percentages with decimal tails that seem to stretch on forever? How do you know when to stop without losing your audience in a sea of digits?
Yeah, that's the art of percentage pronunciation. It's about finding that sweet spot between precision and clarity. Too few decimal places and you can sound imprecise. Too many and you risk overwhelming your listeners. So consider your audience and the level of detail needed.
Yeah.
In a casual conversation, rounding to the nearest whole number might be perfectly fine. But in a financial report, those decimal points they might hold the key to a multi-million-dollar decision.
Right. It's like choosing the right lens for a camera, right? Sometimes you need that wide angle view, other times you need a real close up. Now, speaking of percentages, what are basis points, and why do people use them instead of decimals?
Yeah, basis points, they're often used in finance, and they're a way to simplify the language of percentages, especially when you're dealing with tiny fractions. So instead of saying 0.05%, they would say 5 basis points.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds a lot more concise, and it avoids the potential for miscommunication when those tiny decimal points can have huge financial implications.
Gotcha. So it's not just about sounding like fancy, but about ensuring clarity and accuracy, right? Especially when those tiny numbers can make a big difference. But percentages can be tricky even when we're not dealing with basis points, especially those year-over-year comparisons.
Yeah. Mastering those year-over-year pronouncements, it's all about rhythm and pacing.
Mm-hmm.
Successful business leaders just seem to effortlessly say things like 27.8% increase year-over-year.
Yeah.
And you notice that subtle pause after the number and before year-over-year.
Yeah.
It creates this really natural flow that's really easy to follow.
It's like they're conducting a numerical orchestra, right?
What?
Creating this symphony of data. And while we're on the topic of percentages, let's clear up the common confusion between percentage points and percentages, right?
That's the distinction that often trips people up.
For sure.
So if a company's market share increases from 10% to 12%, that's a 2 percentage point increase, but a 20% increase. And using the wrong term can lead to serious misinterpretations, especially when you're discussing financial performance or market trends.
Yeah, it's a reminder that precision in language is just as important as precision in numbers. But what about those market share ranges? How can we express those effectively without sounding like a robot reading off a spreadsheet?
Right. When you're presenting ranges, the key is to emphasize the boundaries without making the company's performance sound worse than it actually is.
Yeah.
So for example, instead of saying between 15 and 18%, You could say something like a solid market share ranging from 15 to 18%.
Yeah.
And that subtle shift in wording, it really highlights the positive while acknowledging the range.
It's like framing a picture, right?
Yeah.
The right frame can really enhance the artwork, while the wrong one can detract from it. And speaking of framing, I've noticed that Silicon Valley, with their love of shorthand, they often express percentages with phrases like 5x growth instead of 500% growth.
Yeah, that's another great example of industry-specific language reflecting their values and priorities. In the fast-paced world of tech startups where rapid growth is celebrated, these abbreviations convey a sense of scale and ambition. However, it's crucial to use them strategically. In formal presentations or with audiences who might not be familiar with this kind of jargon, it might come across as too casual or even a bit disrespectful.
Right. It's like wearing a tuxedo to a backyard barbecue. It just doesn't fit the occasion. But speaking of potentially awkward situations, how do we handle those dreaded negative percentages without sounding like we're delivering bad news?
Yeah. That's where the art of framing comes in again. Instead of saying negative 15% growth, which just sounds so clinical and impersonal, consider saying a 15% decline. It acknowledges the change without dwelling on the negativity.
Right.
It's about choosing language that paints a more nuanced and strategic picture.
It's like the difference between saying I lost my job versus I'm exploring new career opportunities. Both are technically true, but the framing changes the entire message. Now, those tongue-twisting KGRs or compound annual growth rates, is there a preferred way to pronounce those?
Yeah, in the financial world, there's kind of this unspoken rule about KGRs. In formal settings, it's generally best to spell out the acronym compound annual growth rate.
Right.
But in more casual conversations, using the individual letters, CAGR, is perfectly acceptable.
Right. It's like having a formal title and a nickname. Each serves a different purpose. Okay, now let's move on to a topic that's universally relevant, right?
Yeah.
Money. Everyone loves to talk about it. But how do we talk about it effectively in a business setting?
Yeah. Money talks. And the way we talk about it in the business world, it really reveals a lot about our expertise and professionalism.
I've always admired those business leaders who can discuss, these $1 million deals with the same ease as talking about the weather. What's their secret?
It's about mastering those really subtle nuances of currency pronunciation, knowing when to use abbreviations like USD versus the full name dollars, or when to say euros versus EUR. That can subtly signal your level of expertise and cultural awareness.
It's like knowing the proper etiquette for different social situations, right? You wouldn't use slang at a formal dinner party or overly formal language at a casual gathering with friends. And while we're talking about navigating different situations, how do you handle those tricky exchange rates, especially when you're juggling multiple currencies in a single conversation?
Yeah. The key with exchange rates is to find a rhythm that sounds natural and professional. It's not just about getting the numbers right, but about creating a flow that makes it easy for your audience to follow. So, for instance, instead of saying the euro is currently trading at $1.15, you could say the euro to dollar exchange rate is currently at 1.15. It's a subtle shift, but it creates a more professional cadence.
It's like a dancer transitioning, smoothly between steps, right? So it's all about the flow. But when it comes to discussing prose changes, particularly when those changes are significant, what's the best way to approach it without sounding like you're delivering bad news?
Instead of just announcing a price change, top sales professionals they create what I call price stories. They weave a narrative that makes the change more relatable, more palatable. So, for instance, instead of saying, the price has increased from $999 to $1,499, they might say something like, we've listened to our customers and we've added some incredible new features to this product. And to reflect that increased value, the price has been adjusted to $1,499, making it an even better investment for your business.
Right. It's like turning a price increase into a value proposition. Suddenly, it's not just about the numbers, but about the benefits. But what about when you're presenting a budget range? Trying to strike that balance between providing specifics and allowing for flexibility. Is there a best practice for expressing those numbers?
The way you express budget ranges can actually have a surprisingly significant impact on how they're perceived. So for instance, saying, a $500 million investment carries a different weight than saying $500 million. Both are technically correct, right? But one might sound more concrete and the other more conceptual, depending on your audience and your objective.
It's like choosing the right paint color for a room, right? Each shade evokes a different mood and feeling. Speaking of subtle differences, is there an unwritten rule about when to include point zero in financial figures?
You've hit on another one of those unspoken rules of the financial world.
Oh, good. I'm glad I can sense those out.
Yeah, in most cases, it's best to drop that point zero when the number is a whole dollar amount. For instance, you would say, $5 million instead of $5,000,000.
Yeah,
it sounds cleaner, more professional, and it subtly aligns you with the conventions of the financial industry.
right.
It's like those extra zeros at the beginning of a ZIP code. They're there, but we don't usually say them out loud.
Yeah.
And before we wrap up this section on money matters, can we talk about how different industries seem to have their own preferred ways of expressing monetary values? Oh, absolutely. The tech industry, for instance, they love to drop those zeros and use letters like 2.5M in Series A funding. But traditional banking, on the other hand, tends to be more formal, more precise, using full pronunciations like $2.5 million.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these subtle differences in language can almost signal which tribe you belong to. But it's a good reminder that being aware of your audience and their expectations is key to effective communication. Now let's shift gears and talk about something that can make or break international business deals, time and date expressions.
Oh yeah. Time is money, as they say. And in the global business arena, clear communication about time and dates, that's absolutely paramount.
I've definitely had my fair share of scheduling mishaps due to time zone confusion. So where do we even begin to unravel this tangled web of time zones and deadlines?
Let's start with project timelines, those intricate roadmaps that guide us through the various phases of a project. I've heard some people pronounce those complex timelines with such ease, like Q3 fiscal year 2024-2025. I'm in awe of their fluency.
I know, right? It's impressive.
There's a definite art to it. The key is to group the elements in a way that creates a natural rhythm. So for instance, instead of saying Q3 fiscal year 2024-2025,
right,
pressing Q3 fiscal year 2024/2025.
Okay, yeah.
It just flows better.
It's like learning a new dance move, right?
Yes.
Once you get the rhythm, it just flows effortlessly. But what about those high stakes deadline discussions? Those can be a real minefield of potential misunderstandings.
Yeah. Precision is crucial when communicating deadlines, especially across time zones and international borders. Instead of just saying, the deadline is the 23rd, specify the month, the year, and the time zone to avoid any ambiguity. For instance, the deadline is the 23rd of February 2025 at 1700 hours GMT. That leaves no room for misinterpretation.
That's a recipe for avoiding those panic last-minute scrambles, right? And speaking of avoiding confusion, what about those tongue-twisting quarter-over-quarter comparisons? How can we make those flow smoothly without stumbling over the numbers?
Yeah, the secret to mastering those quarter-over-quarter comparisons is to break them down into rhythmic groups. So, for example, instead of saying an 18% increase from Q3 fiscal year 2023 to Q4 fiscal year 2024, try saying an 18% increase from Q3 FY23 to Q4 FY24.
Right. It's like a numerical tongue twister. Once you get the rhythm down, it rolls right off the tongue. But before we move on, can we address the elephant in the room here? The fact that different countries start their fiscal years at different times. That's always tripped me up.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's easy to overlook those regional differences. To avoid confusion, simply state the fiscal year, start and end dates when you're communicating across international borders. For example, you could say our Q3 results for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2025 show.
Yeah.
Simple but effective.
Yeah. It's a simple but effective way to level the playing field and ensure everyone's on the same page. And speaking of global communication, let's tackle the beast known as time zones, right?
Yeah.
There seem to be a million ways to refer to them, and I'm always second guessing myself.
Yeah.
Navigating the world of time zones can really feel like entering a labyrinth. But there is a kind of a hierarchy of time zone references in international business. So the most formal is to use the 24-hour clock and the official time zone abbreviation like 1500 hours EST.
Yeah.
But in less formal settings, using AM, PM, and the colloquial time zone name like 3 p.m. Eastern is perfectly acceptable. Okay, it's like choosing between a formal address and a nickname, right? Each has its place. But before we conclude this discussion about time, can we delve into the subtleties of duration expressions? I've always wondered why some people say 2 weeks while others say 10 business days. It seems like there's a whole hidden language beneath the surface.
You're right. The choice of duration expression can subtly influence how a time frame is perceived. 2 weeks, that sounds more casual, more flexible, while 10 business days kind of conveys this sense of precision and urgency. It's all about choosing the language that best suits the context and your intended message.
Yeah, it's fascinating how even small variations in language can really shape perception and create different expectations. Now let's move on to a topic that often sends chills down people's spines. Statistics. Those numbers can be really powerful tools, but they can also be incredibly dry and difficult to present effectively.
Yeah, statistics are the foundation of so many business decisions, but they often need a little storytelling magic to bring them to life and really capture people's attention.
I've been in countless presentations where the speaker droned on and on about statistical data, and my eyes glazed over faster than you can say p-value. How do we escape that trap and make those numbers sing?
Instead of simply stating data trends in this monotone voice, use descriptive language that helps your audience visualize the change. So, for instance, instead of saying, we observed a statistically significant upward trend of 23.7%, you could say, we've witnessed a remarkable surge in customer engagement with a 23.7% jump in just 6 months. This positive momentum suggests.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. It's like painting a picture with numbers instead of just reading off a list of ingredients. But what about when we need to compare statistics? Is there a way to do that without sounding like a human calculator?
There are these really subtle psychological nuances at play. Even in how we compare numbers. Mm-hmm. So saying twice as likely is often more impactful than saying 100% more likely, even though they're mathematically equivalent.
Yeah.
The former, it feels more tangible, more relatable, while the latter sounds more abstract, more technical.
Right. It's a reminder that we're not just dealing with numbers, but with human perceptions and emotions, right?
Right. Yeah.
So how do we navigate those emotional waters when discussing probability? How do we make them sound exciting instead of like a boring weather report?
Instead of simply stating a probability as a cold, hard fact, frame it as an exciting possibility. So, for instance, instead of saying there's a 78.3% chance of market expansion, you could say we're poised for significant growth.
Right.
Our analysis indicates a strong likelihood, nearly 80%, of successful market expansion within the next year.
Okay, I like that. It's like turning a statistical forecast into a motivational pep talk. But speaking of motivation, how do we handle those dreaded p-values without making everyone's eyes glaze over?
Yeah, p-values, they're crucial for assessing statistical significance, but they can be really tough to explain to a non-technical audience.
Yeah.
And the key is to provide context and comparison.
Yeah.
So for instance, instead of saying the p-value is 0.0231, you could say our findings are highly significant. the probability of observing these results by chance is less than 3%, which strongly supports our hypothesis in that.
Right. It's like translating a scientific equation into plain English, right? Suddenly it makes sense. And speaking of making sense, how do we explain correlations in a way that people actually understand and remember?
Instead of just stating the correlation coefficient, use descriptive language that helps your audience grasp the relationship between variables. So for example, instead of saying there's a strong positive correlation of 0.89 between customer satisfaction and repeat purchases, you could say. Happy customers are loyal customers. Our data reveals a strong link between customer satisfaction and repeat business. The higher the satisfaction, the more likely they are to come back for more.
Yeah, that's great. It's like turning a dry statistical observation into a relatable human insight, right? Suddenly it clicks. But before we get too comfortable with those statistical insights, let's talk about the challenge of explaining complex statistical concepts to a non-technical audience. How do we avoid overwhelming them with jargon and equations? Yeah, the key is to break down those complex concepts into smaller, more digestible chunks, using analogies and real-world examples that everyone can relate to. So, for instance, when explaining standard deviation, you might say, imagine we're measuring the height of everyone in this room, and standard deviation tells us how spread out those heights are. So, a large standard deviation, that means we've got a really wide range of heights, from very short to very tall. A small standard deviation means most people are roughly the same height. Okay, yeah, that's a great analogy. It makes the concept so much clearer. Now let's move on to a topic that can really make or break your presentation. Numerical comparisons. They're essential for drawing conclusions and making decisions, but how do we handle them effectively without getting tongue-tied?
Comparisons are really the backbone of data analysis, but there's some subtle nuances to master. Let's start with those common comparative terms, like greater than, higher than, and more than.
Yeah, I've stumbled over those terms more times than I can count. Is there a preferred way to use them, or are they pretty much interchangeable?
The choice of term really depends on the context and the level of formality. So greater than, that's the most formal and precise, often used in mathematical or technical discussions. Higher than, that's more colloquial and suitable for general business conversations. And then more than is the most informal and versatile, appropriate for a wide range of situations.
Right. So it's like choosing the right tool for the job, right?
Yeah.
A screwdriver for a small screw, and a wrench for a larger bolt. But speaking of tools, how do we compare multiple market segments without sounding like we're just reading off a spreadsheet?
Instead of listing comparisons in this really dry linear fashion, try using a technique called comparison cascade.
Oh.
And that involves creating a narrative that flows smoothly from one comparison to the next, highlighting the key, insights along the way. So for instance, instead of saying, market A is 23% larger than market B, which is 15% larger than market C, and market D is 10% smaller than market A,
right,
you could say market A is clearly the dominant player, boasting a 23% advantage over market B. While market B holds a comfortable lead over market C, it's worth noting that market D is trailing behind market A by a significant margin.
Okay, yeah, it's like turning a list of statistics into a compelling story. Suddenly the data comes alive. And speaking of bringing numbers to life, what about those range descriptions? How do we articulate those clearly without getting lost in a sea of decimal points?
When you're describing ranges like between 15.7 million and 16.2 million units, the rhythm of your delivery can really make all the difference. Think of it like a musical phrase with the numbers flowing smoothly from one to the next. For instance, we expect sales to fall between 15.7 million and 16.2 million units.
Yeah. It's like learning to play a musical instrument, right? Once you get the rhythm down, it sounds effortless and harmonious. But what about those numerical rankings that often pop up in business reports? Is there a more engaging way to present them than just stating the position?
Yeah, the way you frame a numerical ranking can really influence how it's perceived. So, for instance, saying, ranked third out of 27 has a different impact than in the top 3 of 27.
Yeah.
The latter sounds more impressive, right? And it really emphasizes the achievement.
Right. It's like highlighting the positive instead of dwelling on the negative, right? It shifts the entire perspective. But when we're comparing multiple data points simultaneously, how do we avoid overwhelming our audience with too much information?
One effective technique is the data storytelling pyramid.
Okay.
And you start with this broad overview, and then you gradually drill down into the details, creating this sense of intrigue and discovery. So, for example, instead of saying Region A sales increased by 15%, Region B sales decreased by 5%, Region C sales remain flat, and Region D sales increased by 20%.
Right.
You could say, we're seeing some interesting regional variations in sales performance. Overall, we're up, but some regions are definitely outperforming others. Let's take a closer look at the numbers. Region D is leading the pack with a 20% increase, followed by Region A with a 15% gain. Region C held steady, while Region B experienced a slight dip. Now let's dive into the factors driving these differences.
Okay. Yeah. It's like building a pyramid, right? You start with a broad base and then gradually work your way up to the pinnacle, revealing new insights along the way. But before we wrap up this discussion about comparisons, can we talk about the order in which we present numbers? Does it really matter?
It might seem like a small detail,
Yeah.
but the order in which you present those numbers can certainly influence how they're processed and remembered. Generally, it's best to present the most important or impactful numbers first, followed by the supporting details. And that really helps your audience grasp the key takeaways and reduces cognitive overload.
Right. Right. It's like composing a symphony, right? You want to start with the most attention-grabbing theme and then gradually introduce those supporting melodies. Now, let's shift our focus to a topic that's especially relevant in today's, globalized business landscape: industry-specific number conventions. It's like everyone's speaking the same language, but with a slightly different accent.
Yeah, you're right. Each industry has its own unique, lingo and customs, and this extends to how they use and talk about numbers. And understanding these nuances can really help you navigate different business cultures with ease and avoid potential miscommunications.
Yeah. Let's start with the tech industry, that fast-paced world of innovation and disruption, right? They seem to have their own numerical code filled with abbreviations and shorthand expressions. It's like they're speaking a different dialect.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Their fondness for abbreviations, like 10x growth and 2K daily active users. It's more than just as a stylistic choice. It reflects their obsession with speed, with scale, and disruption. They're not just conveying information. They're projecting an image of exponential growth and ambition. It's a way of signaling to investors and the market that they're playing in a whole different league.
So it's not just about efficiency, but about creating a certain aura, a certain
Exactly.
a certain sense that they're on the cutting edge. But then you have the financial sector where precision and formality reigns supreme. It's like stepping into a different world where every word seems to carry the weight of 1,000 spreadsheets. Why is that?
In the financial world, trust and accuracy are paramount. Every digit matters, and any ambiguity can have serious consequences. That's why they're so meticulous about using those full pronunciations and avoiding any language that could be misconstrued. They're speaking the language of risk management and accountability, where a misplaced decimal point can cost millions.
Yeah, it's like the difference between a casual conversation and a legal contract, right? The language changes to reflect the level of formality and the potential consequences. And what about manufacturing? They seem to have their own unique way of talking about numbers too. It's like they're speaking the language of machines and precision engineering. What's behind that?
Absolutely. In manufacturing, it's all about efficiency and precision. They use specific units of measurement, and they really emphasize accuracy in their pronouncements. It's a reflection of their focus on process control and quality assurance. Every number has a specific meaning and a purpose, and there's very little room for ambiguity.
So instead of saying hourly output, they might say, units per hour.
Exactly.
It's about focusing on the metrics that drive their operations. And then you have retail, which is all about attracting customers and driving sales. They seem to have a real knack for making numbers sound appealing and persuasive. How do they do that?
In retail, numbers are often used to create a sense of urgency or value. Think about those prices ending in a 0.99 or those 50% off promotions. They're carefully crafted to trigger psychological biases and encourage us to buy. They're speaking the language of persuasion, using numbers to create a sense of scarcity, urgency, and just irresistible deals.
Right. It's like turning numbers into a sales pitch, right? Suddenly they become tools for influencing behavior. But speaking of influencing behavior, what about the startup world? They seem to have their own unique set of metrics and jargon, all geared towards showcasing their potential and attracting investors. What's the secret behind their numerical language?
Startups are all about rapid growth and innovation, so they often use metrics that highlight their progress and their potential, even if those numbers might not tell the whole story. They're speaking the language of optimism and possibility, using numbers to paint this picture of a bright future. It's a way of inspiring investors and attracting talent, even in the face of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's like they're weaving a numerical narrative, a story of growth and disruption that really captures the imagination. But with all these different numerical dialects floating around, it seems like it'd be easy to miscommunicate, right?
Yeah.
How do we avoid those pitfalls?
That's where awareness and adaptability come in. It's about knowing your audience and understanding the context of the conversation. So, if you're presenting to a group of tech investors, you could probably get away with using more casual language and abbreviations. But if you're addressing a board of directors in a more traditional industry, it's best to err on the side of formality and precision.
Right. So it's all about code switching, choosing the right numerical language for each situation. It's like knowing when to wear a suit versus jeans and a t-shirt. You want to dress appropriately for the occasion. Now let's talk about something that affects every business professional, regardless of industry. Number-based decision-making. We all use numbers to inform our choices, but how can we ensure that we're using them effectively? What are the pitfalls to avoid, and what are the strategies for wielding those numbers with power and precision?
That's a great question. One of the most powerful techniques is what I call numerical storytelling. It's about taking those dry, KPIs and metrics and weaving them into a compelling narrative that really drives action.
Can you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. Let's say your customer satisfaction score is 4.3 out of 5. Instead of just stating that number, you could say something like, we're thrilled that our customers are consistently rating us above 4 out of 5 stars. And this tells us we're on the right track, but we're not stopping there. We're digging deeper into the feedback to identify areas where we can go from great to exceptional.
Ooh, okay, I like that. It's like you're turning the number into a call to action. And what about when you need to communicate target numbers in a way that really inspires commitment?
The key here is to use really strong, declarative language that emphasizes certainty and determination. So, for example, instead of saying we're aiming for 20% growth, you could say we're locking in on a 20% increase in revenue this year. This is our line in the sand, and we're fully committed to achieving it.
Wow. Okay, that definitely sounds more powerful. It's like you're drawing a line in the sand and saying this is where we're going no matter what.
And speaking of lines in the sand, what about those critical threshold values that trigger specific actions?
Yeah, when you're communicating decision thresholds, clarity and precision, they're absolutely paramount. You want to leave no room for misinterpretation. So, for example, instead of saying anything above 75% is a go, you could say our decision threshold is 75%. If we hit this target, we're we're full steam ahead. If we fall short, we'll reassess and adjust our strategy accordingly.
Okay, yeah. That definitely leaves no room for ambiguity. It's like you're setting up a clear set of rules for the game. And speaking of games, how can we use numbers to motivate our teams to encourage a growth mindset? When you're presenting performance metrics, focus on progress and potential rather than just stating the numbers. So, for example, instead of saying, we're tracking at 97%, you could say we're currently at 97% of our target. That's fantastic progress, but we know we can push even further. Let's brainstorm some ideas to close that final gap and achieve a perfect score.
Yeah. It's like you're turning the numbers into a challenge, a quest for continuous improvement. And before we wrap up this section, can we talk about the impact of how we group numbers on decision making? Does it really matter if we say 15 out of 20 versus 75%?
Yeah, it might seem like a small detail, but the way we group numbers can subtly influence how they're perceived and evaluated.
Right.
Sometimes presenting a ratio like 15 out of 20 can feel more tangible, more relatable than a percentage. It's like we can picture those 15 individuals within a group of 20 making the information more concrete.
It's amazing how much nuance there is in the way we use and perceive numbers. It's like there's a whole hidden language operating beneath the surface. Okay, let's shift our focus to the global stage. How can we ensure clear and effective numerical communication when dealing with international audiences?
That's a crucial question in today's interconnected world. The first step is to be aware of the different number formatting conventions used around the globe.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised how much confusion can arise from something as simple as a comma versus a period as a decimal separator.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been in situations where a misplaced comma has caused.
I've definitely been in situations where a misplaced comma has caused major headaches. So what's the best way to avoid those cross-cultural number blunders? When in doubt, state the format explicitly. So you could say something like, our revenue for last quarter was 12,500 euros, written as 12.500 in this format. That way everyone's on the same page right from the start.
Yeah. It's like providing a numerical roadmap to prevent anyone from getting lost in translation. And speaking of translation, what about those cultural number preferences we mentioned earlier? How can we be mindful of those when communicating internationally?
It's all about doing your homework, understanding the cultural context. Some cultures associate certain numbers with luck or misfortune, so it's best to just avoid using those numbers if you're unsure of their significance. A little research can go a long way in preventing unintended offense or miscommunication.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like learning the local customs before traveling to a new country, right? You want to be respectful and avoid any faux pas. and speaking of travel, let's talk about those tricky unit conversions that often come up in international business. How do we make those transitions between metric and imperial units feel natural and avoid those mental math struggles in real time?
Yeah, preparation is key there. Convert those units in advance and practice presenting them in a way that feels seamless and effortless. For instance, you could say the dimensions of this new facility are 50 meters by 25 meters, which is roughly equivalent to 164 feet by 82 feet.
Yeah.
By providing both the metric and imperial measurements, you're catering to everyone's understanding without disrupting the flow of your presentation.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like offering a bilingual menu at a restaurant, right? Everyone can find something they understand. Now, I've heard about this concept of numerical politeness, the idea that the level of precision we use with numbers can actually convey different social cues depending on the culture. Is there any truth to that?
Absolutely. Cultures, they vary widely in their expectations around numerical precision. In some cultures, rounding numbers or using approximations in casual conversation is perfectly acceptable, even expected. In other cultures, precision, that's highly valued, and anything less might be perceived as sloppy or disrespectful. It's like understanding the appropriate level of formality in language, right? You wouldn't address your boss the same way you'd chat with a close friend.
So how do we avoid those numerical faux pas, when interacting with colleagues or clients from different cultures?
The key is to do your research, understand those cultural norms, and when in doubt, err on the side of precision. But also pay attention to the cues and preferences of those you're interacting with. Adaptability and sensitivity, they're really key.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's all about reading the room, both literally and figuratively. Now let's talk about those large numbers that often get lost in translation. I'm looking at you. Billion. It seems to have a different meaning depending on where you are in the world.
Yes, the billion dilemma. It's a classic example of how these seemingly simple words can really trip us up in cross-cultural communication. To avoid confusion, always state the full numerical value, followed by the word for the large number. For example, you could say the company's annual revenue is $1,000 million or $1 billion, depending on your definition. It might seem a little redundant, but that extra clarification can prevent a world of misunderstanding.
Yeah, I like that. It's like providing a numerical safety net, ensuring that everyone lands on the same page. Now, speaking of landing on the same page, can you elaborate on the importance of numerical contextualization? Why is it so crucial to provide that extra layer of information when presenting numbers?
Numbers, without context, can be like puzzle pieces scattered on a table. They might be interesting in isolation, but they don't tell a complete story. Context, that's what gives those numbers meaning and relevance. So always provide the necessary background information to help your audience understand the significance of the data you're presenting. This might include explaining the units of measurement, the time period covered, or the external factors that might have influenced the results. So for example, instead of just saying, sales increased by 10%, you might say sales increased by 10% in the last quarter compared to the same period last year. This growth was primarily driven by the launch of our new product line in the European market.
Oh, okay. That's a much richer and more informative way to present that data. It's like adding color and depth to a black and white sketch. Okay, now it's time to dive into the digital realm. How can we ensure clear and confident pronunciation of those technical numbers that seem to dominate our lives these days?
Those technical numbers, they can feel like a foreign language sometimes, but with a little practice you can master them. The key is to break them down into smaller, more manageable chunks and articulate each digit clearly. For instance, when pronouncing an IP address like 192.168.1.1, you would say 192.168.1.1.
Right. That's much easier to follow than trying to rattle off the whole string of numbers at once. And what about those tricky software version numbers with all their dots and decimals? How can we pronounce those in a way that sounds clear and professional?
Yeah. When pronouncing software version numbers, it's important to articulate each element clearly and use the correct terminology. For instance, instead of saying version 2.0, you would say version 2.0. It's a small distinction, but it makes a big difference in terms of clarity and professionalism.
Right. It's like knowing the difference between saying, ain't and isn't. One might be acceptable in casual conversation, but the other reflects a higher level of professionalism. And speaking of professionalism, how can we present those technical numbers, especially those complex digital metrics, to a non-technical audience without making their eyes glaze over?
Yeah, when presenting those digital metrics, it's all about finding that right balance between accuracy and accessibility. Use clear, concise language. Avoid jargon and focus on the key takeaways that are relevant to your audience. So for instance, instead of saying we achieved a 10-fold increase in website traffic last month, you could say, our website traffic exploded last month, growing by 10 times.
Yeah. That's much more impactful and engaging. It's like translating a complex scientific paper into a captivating news headline. Suddenly it's engaging and understandable. But what about those long strings of binary and hexadecimal numbers? They look like something out of the Matrix. Are there any tricks for making those pronounceable?
Even those seemingly cryptic binary and hexadecimal numbers can be, they can be tamed with the right approach. One technique is called pattern grouping, where you break down that string of numbers into smaller, more recognizable chunks. For instance, instead of saying 101 to 1100, you could say 10, 1100. It's still technical, but it's a little bit easier on the ears and the brain.
Right. It's like taking a random jumble of letters and turning them into a pronounceable word. Suddenly it makes sense. Any other tips for making those technical numbers, roll off the tongue smoothly?
Pacing and articulation are key. When pronouncing those technical numbers, speak slowly and distinctly, emphasizing each digit. Rushing through them or mumbling can lead to confusion and errors.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with complex sequences. Practice makes perfect.
It's like learning a new musical instrument, right? It takes time and dedication to master those intricate finger movements.
Okay, let's shift our focus back to those everyday business measurements that we encounter in various professional settings. Any tips for making those pronouncements sound smooth and polished?
When pronouncing those business measurements, like volume or weight or distance, break them down into smaller groups of numbers and articulate each unit clearly. For instance, instead of saying 20,000 cubic meters, try saying 20,000 cubic meters. Those slight pauses help to separate the numbers and make them a little bit easier to digest.
Right. It's like adding punctuation to a sentence. It makes the information more digestible and easier to understand. And speaking of making things easier, what about those dreaded conversions between metric and imperial units? I always feel like I'm juggling numbers in my head, trying to convert on the fly. Yeah. When it comes to unit conversions, the best approach is to be prepared. Convert the units in advance, and then present them confidently using clear and concise language. For instance, you could say, this conference room is 10 meters long, which is approximately 33 feet.
Right. It's like offering a bilingual service. Everyone can understand what you're saying, regardless of their preferred system of measurement. And speaking of catering to different preferences, what about those weight and mass measurements? It seems like every culture has its own favorite units and ways of pronouncing them.
You're absolutely right. When you're communicating across cultures, it's important to use the units that are most familiar to your audience and to pronounce them clearly and correctly. For example, you wouldn't want to say kilos to an American audience or pounds to a European audience.
Right. It's like knowing the appropriate greeting in different cultures. You wouldn't bow in France or shake hands in Japan. And speaking of navigating those cultural nuances, how can we ensure that our speed and frequency measurements are understood clearly, regardless of language barriers?
When pronouncing speed and frequency measurements, it's important to articulate each unit clearly and use the appropriate terminology for your audience. For instance, you might say, this machine operates at 60 cycles per second, which is equivalent to 60 hertz.
Yeah.
Providing both the numerical value and the unit of measurement helps to minimize confusion.
Okay, yeah. It's like providing subtitles for a foreign film. Everyone can follow along, even if they don't speak the language. Now, before we wrap up this segment on business measurements, can you offer any tips for finding that sweet spot between precision and approachability?
That's a great question. While accuracy is paramount when dealing with measurements, it's also important to avoid sounding overly technical or pedantic. The key is to use the appropriate level of precision for the context and your audience. So for instance, if you're discussing the dimensions of a room for a casual conversation, rounding to the nearest foot might be sufficient. But if you're presenting technical specifications for a construction project, you need to be much more precise.
Right. So it's all about choosing that right level of detail for the situation. It's like knowing when to wear a suit versus jeans and a t-shirt. You want to dress, appropriately for the occasion. Okay, it's time for our grand finale here, the numerical trends and patterns. How can we transform those dry data points into a captivating narrative that will leave a lasting impression on our audience?
Describing those numerical trends and patterns effectively, it's all about using language that paints a really vivid picture and highlights those key insights instead of relying on dry, technical jargon. Use descriptive phrases and metaphors that really make those trends come alive.
Okay, can you give us an example of how to turn those data trends into a captivating story?
Absolutely. Instead of saying, we observed a statistically significant upward trend in sales over the past year. You could say sales have been skyrocketing over the past year, like a rocket taking off.
Wow. Okay, that's much more impactful. It's like turning a boring spreadsheet into an exciting, action movie. And what about when we need to describe those repeating patterns that often pop up in business data? How can we make those patterns more memorable, more relatable?
When describing patterns, use language that emphasizes the regularity, the predictability of the trend. So, for example, instead of saying the data exhibits a cyclical pattern with peaks in the summer months and troughs in the winter months, you could say sales tend to heat up in the summer and cool down in the winter like a predictable tide. It's a simple yet effective way to make that data stick in people's minds.
Right. Yeah. It's like turning a complex data visualization into a simple, relatable image. And speaking of images, how can we make those historical data comparisons more vivid and meaningful?
When comparing historical data, use language that highlights the key changes and provides context for the comparison. So instead of saying compared to 5 years ago, our efficiency has increased by 157%, you could say we've come a long way in the past 5 years. Our efficiency has more than doubled thanks to our relentless focus on innovation and process improvement. It's like we've traded in our old bicycle for a high-speed race car.
Oh, that's a fantastic analogy. It really drives home the point about progress and transformation. And speaking of driving, how can we effectively communicate those rate of change expressions without sounding like we're reading from a physics textbook?
The key is to use language that conveys the speed and the magnitude of the change in a really clear and concise way. So, for instance, instead of saying, we're experiencing an accelerating rate of growth, you can say our growth is surging forward, gaining momentum like a runaway train.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It really captures that sense of unstoppable progress. Well, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about speaking numbers in business. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners as they embark on their journey to become numerical masters?
Remember, numbers are more than just digits on a page or a screen. They have the power to inform, to persuade, to inspire, and even to entertain. By mastering the art of speaking numbers effectively, you can really unlock their full potential and transform your communication from ordinary to extraordinary.
That's a great reminder. And to help our listeners put these techniques into practice, I challenge you to choose one strategy you learned today and try it out in your next meeting or presentation. You might be surprised at the impact even a small change can make. Thanks for joining us on this numerical adventure. Until next time, keep counting on your improved communication skills. Let me know if you'd like me to help with the other parts as well.